Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Conquering the Virtual Interview. My name is Rebecca Luebbert, and I'm the Director of Career and Business Engagement. I'll go into my introduction a little bit more later. But yes, thank you so much for being with us today for Conquering the Virtual Interview. And today's webinar is powered by our alumni members and our donors, and they powered the alumni webinar series. So thank you so much for your support and membership. And if you're tuning in today and you'd like to tune in by phone instead, you may do so by dialing the number on the screen here and entering the webinar ID. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you're welcome to drop your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll get to those questions towards the end. And I'll be having assistance from the Director of Student Engagement, Marissa Smith, and she'll be helping me with those questions. She won't come on camera, but she'll be helping to kind of fill those questions and ask me those questions towards the end. So yes, definitely if you have any questions, feel free to ask at any point. And this webinar will be recorded and shared with all those who registered, as well as those who registered who are participating and those who are unable to make it today. And it'll also live on our YouTube video, our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to find the information there. And afterwards, you should expect an email from me in about 2 business days with the webinar link and any information I share within today's webinar, including resources. So yes. Again, my name is Rebecca Luebbert. I'm the Director of Career and Business Engagement with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. I've been working in higher education for 12 years now. I began my career originally in academic advising and then transitioned into career services about 7 years now. And previous to my current role, I worked in the College of Biological Sciences at the University of Minnesota, where I led and worked with a team of career coaches to career coach students, managed events and so forth. And I really enjoyed being a part of the individual experience and help coaching others to success. And I get the opportunity to do that through this role as well. I'm responsible for career programming. I'm responsible for our liaison work with our corporate networks. And I'm also working on building entrepreneurship and small business programming as well. So definitely stay tuned for that. And then today after the webinar, I'll be sending out a survey. So definitely send me any feedback that you have on today's webinar, ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see. I'd love to have the information so I could definitely think about what programming we might want to bring forth. All right, so we're gonna get started. So today I always like to do like kind of an overview about what we're gonna be talking about today. So today we'll be talking about virtual and phone interviewing, building confidence, because that's often a very important piece of interviewing. We're going to talk about a little bit more about skills that employers are seeking, preparing for the interview, responding to interview questions, and then at the end we'll have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A from any of the viewers today. And you'll just drop your questions within the Q&A box. So yes, welcome. All right. So I always like to start off with a poll just to kind of gauge an understanding of where people are at and familiarity with certain topics. And so today, my poll question for you will be, what percentage of employers pre-pandemic were using virtual interviewing? And I'm going to launch that poll right now. And you'll just kind of take a guess at what you think in terms of percentage of employers pre-pandemic that were using virtual interviewing. And then once I see enough votes, I will reveal those results. All right, so it looks like we got a good chunk of people who responded so far, and I will show you those results. And so many of you believe that pre-pandemic, 25% of employers were using virtual interviewing. Some stated 30%, 30% of you thought, or 31% of you thought 30% was the answer. 10% of you said 50%, and 6% of you said 60% were using virtual interviewing pre-pandemic. Well, actually, according to SHRM, which is the Society of Human Resources and Management, the actual results, the actual answer is 50%. So 50% of employers are using virtual interviewing already pre-pandemic. So that's a good chunk of employers who are using this as part of their vetting system, and it's a good way for them to kind of meet a lot of candidates in a shorter period of time and kind of expedite the interview process. And so many employers are already turning to virtual interviewing, and now when the age of pandemic, this is even more so the case. And haven't got any numbers yet on that, but I'm sure we'll see that look more like 80 to 90%. I'm very sure of that. All right, so let me close this out. All right, so just kind of go over the nuts and bolts of what I'll be discussing a little bit further in terms of what makes a successful interview. We're gonna talk about preparation. We'll talk about testing, testing in terms of your technology. We'll talk a little bit more about practicing your answers to common questions, the actual interview, and follow-up. So those are some of the steps in a nutshell in terms of what makes a successful interview. All right, so just going to technology first, which I think is the core of thinking about conquering the virtual interview is getting really comfortable with your technology and getting really comfortable speaking on camera, which can be a challenge. I know I still wrestle with that as well, but I think it's really important to kind of manage both building confidence in yourself in terms of being on camera, but then also having confidence that you have the technical know-how or have managed the technology piece in some ways. So we'll go into that. So I'm thinking about the environments. You want to sort of prep your scene. You're creating kind of a backdrop for your interview. You're wanting to create a scene in some way. So think of it like a movie scene in some ways. And that's kind of what I created for myself today. I made sure that my backdrop was clean, that there was nothing distracting behind me, that the interviewers could focus on me and what I'm saying. If I wanted to kind of dress up or jazz up my background a little bit more, I could have a nice bookcase background if I had one, or something that maybe a nice picture or portrait behind me. So that might be another option for you if you do have some nice background. But in my case, I like to use a nice clean background so the focus is on me as the presenter. And then lighting is very important as well. I'm working from my basement, and I know many of you are working from your homes and have different spaces and different areas of your home that you typically work in, but definitely try to work in a more lighted area. So thinking about not having your back against the source of light is really important. So I notice when I sit in my kitchen, for example, and my back is against the window, which is the source of light, there is a big shadow that's cast over my face and you can't really see me. So you definitely want to make sure that the interviewers can see you clearly, that they can see your facial expressions, see your enthusiasm, and that there isn't any distractions or anything taken away from your actual interview. And another thing you could consider if lighting is something of an issue is thinking about maybe investing in a LED light or a ring lighting, which is actually what I have today. It sort of holds like a phone. It can hold a phone and it has like a ring light around it. And those you can find usually on Amazon. So that's an option. There's also a LED light option that is like circular in nature and just has lights around it, and you can attach it to your laptop or your phone. And so that way it's really mobile and you can move it around to where you need it. So that's another option too, if you can invest in something like that and you're in need of good lighting, that would be a good resource for you as well. So yeah, avoid messy rooms. Definitely don't want to have anything distracting. Virtual backgrounds. So virtual backgrounds can be really nice if it's done well, if it's clean, if there isn't anything super distracting within that background. Those can be really nice, but I know not everyone has a technology set up on their laptops to have a virtual background. So you would need to have something called a green screen on your laptop, and typically older computers don't usually have that, and you may need to do some additional updates to your hard drive to install that. So, just if you do have virtual backgrounds, test them out in advance to see how they look, see if there's any fuzziness to it. That's often something common that I've seen where someone has a virtual background and it's pretty fuzzy. You see, maybe you see their face and stuff, but the things that behind them are looking a little off center, or it's a little fuzzy or too dark or something like that. So definitely clean lines, clean background. And in terms of thinking about distractions, so I know we're working from home in the time of COVID, and it can be very hard to work with minimal distractions and minimal noise. And that's something that I struggle with as well. So, do your best to talk to your family members or those around you in terms of keeping the noise to a minimum, or go to a room where there's less distractions or less noise. I often like to mute my notifications on my computer. So if you go to your search bar and type in notifications, you'll see notifications and settings pop up, and then just mute those, because you don't want your calendar popping up on your during your interview, or your emails notifying you that you received an email or anything like that. So no pings or dings while you're interviewing. So definitely try to minimize that noise and distraction. And I often like to put a sign up maybe on the back of my laptop to say, currently in an interview, need 20 minutes, thank you, on the back of my laptop, so that anyone passing by will know that what exactly I'm doing and why, you know, I need complete silence in some ways. But if there is an instance where there is a distraction, a cat, a crying baby, or something like that, that's okay. I think it's not going to take away from your interview. It's something that's going to happen naturally in our environments that we're working in right now. And so it's just a matter of how you respond to that distraction and how you move forward. So, taking care of whatever is in front of you. If it's a cat crawling over your lap, kind of kindly remove the cat, or if the cat's insistent, give the cat a back rub while you're interviewing. But people are pretty understanding and know that many of us are working from home or are in our home environments at this time. All right. Something else that I like to do before the interview is to really think about what my talking points are going to be. So thinking about those projects that I worked on that I'm really proud of, that I want to make sure that I talk about during my interview. And so maybe I'm making a note to myself that says project management skills, and then a one-word blurb that signals to me some project that I worked on, like environmental or something. And then that triggers for me a story that I've already prepared. And I'll talk about more about preparing stories for your interview in a bit. But keeping this information nearby is helpful. So keeping Post-it notes maybe on your laptop or around your laptop that you can quickly glance at without being too distracting to the interviewer can be a great way to have a helpful reminder of some of the things that you want to make sure that you cover during your interview. You don't want to be clicking around during your interview or searching for information or looking at your resume on your laptop while you're interviewing. So definitely make sure that you have prepared in advance what understanding what your qualifications are and how they match the job description and what your talking points will be during the interview, so you're not shifting through paper or clicking around on your computer while you're interviewing. And then another thing I mentioned here is having a nice legal notepad, which is really nice, or some notebook in front of you that you can take notes, because it's very important to still take notes while you're interviewing, but in a way that does not cause distraction. So I often may jot down like a keyword or two keywords that a particular interviewer mentioned during the interview, so that later on I can prepare a more intentional thank you letter. And I'll talk more about that. The notepad and the pen also serves as a place to house any questions that you have for your interviewers. So I often write down my questions that I want to ask for my interviewers on my pad of paper, and I usually aim for no more than 3 to 5 questions that I'm planning to ask my interviewers. And so it's a good place just to have those questions so that you don't have to remember them off the top of your head. And it also shows that you've prepared, because if you have questions that are more specific in nature and you're able to ask those questions, that's a really good use of both your time and the interviewer's time. All right. So I mentioned before about preparing and testing your technology. So when you, so say for example, you're doing a Zoom or a Skype call, you definitely want to download that software onto your computer, onto your hard drive, rather than just logging in from a URL, because it'll often give you access, just kind of a clearer access to that software, and you won't have to worry about any additional updates or things like that. I often say you want to log in at least a day before your interview to test your technology, download the software, and then test to see how you sound on camera, test to see how you look on camera as well, and test to see like what your background looks like as well. So sometimes it can be hard to hear the person speaking on the other end based on the acoustics in the room. And so you may want to invest in a headphone set or wireless headphones for clarity. And that way your voice comes in crystal clear to the interviewer and there isn't any muffles or outside distracting noises. And it's also a good way for you to hear the interviewers and when they're speaking to you, which can be challenging sometimes if there are other things going on at home. All right, ensuring that you have a stable internet connection. This can be difficult. It's often suggested that you are Ethernet connected rather than Wi-Fi connected to the internet, just to ensure a more stable internet connection. And so this is something I'm suggesting to you. If you have Ethernet cord, definitely use it and make sure that you are hardwired to your laptop or to your computer so you have a more stable connection. All right. All right, so making sure I covered all these points here. We talked about disabling pop-ups and notifications, very important. Definitely mute your phone, which I'm not even sure if I did today, so let me just double check. Yes, I did. I muted my phone. So definitely mute your phone, keep it on either vibrate or mute. Probably mute is probably your best because you're not likely gonna take a phone call during your interview. So there's no need to have it really even on vibrate. So consider putting it on mute, putting it away, out of sight if need be. And then, yes, keep all windows closed. So sometimes you hear a truck pass by, you hear birds, there's wind, there's other distractions. So keeping the windows closed is also a helpful way to avoid distractions. And something that mentioned here about maintaining eye contact, which can be difficult because you're looking at the interviewer. Sometimes we get distracted by looking at ourselves when we're talking, which I'm guilty of. So I want to see, how do I look on camera? But a good way to avoid doing that, which I did not do today, is by placing a sticker right by the light on the laptop. So place a sticker right by the light on your laptop so you remember where to look at all times. And definitely when you're looking into the camera, like really look into the camera as if you're talking to the person on the other side, so you're building a connection with them. Something that I guess it's kind of taken away from the virtual interview versus in-person interview is the ability to build a real connection with the person on the other side. And so eye contact is really important for building that connection on the other side, as well as building rapport. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's really important because that's something that can be lost when we are doing virtual interviewing. And I mentioned before, placing a sign behind your laptop, yes, and embrace any unwanted visitors and maintain composure, which can be difficult. But yes, definitely can do all of those things. All right, so as you can see today, I dressed for the part. Usually I wear more of a sweater or similar outfit, even for webinars I'm doing for the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. But for today's purpose and purpose of talking about interviewing, I dressed in business professional. And it's very important to dress the part for the interview, whether it's business professional or business casual for your industry. I typically err on the side of business professional, which I feel it's better to overdress than to underdress. Is usually how that's kind of like my motto. I've heard it before, others say it. I'm not sure where it stems from exactly, but I think it's always better to overdress than to underdress for the interview. And it's very important to dress for the interview, whether that's a phone interview or in-person interview, because your confidence will be heightened and will exude, and that will really shine through. And it also shows that you're taking the time to think about the interview and prepare for the interview in advance, and taking the time to just put those extra attention to details, which really goes far for the person on the other side who's interviewing you. And I'll show some pictures of what this means as well. So just kind of briefly about the phone interview. So similar to some things I mentioned, there's only a few things to note here. You'll probably be using your cell phone. Many of us don't have landlines, but you'll probably be using your cell phone. But if you have a phone, whether you have a phone interview or a virtual interview, it's always important to get a phone number from the person interviewing you in case there is technical difficulties. So say someone reaches out to you for a phone interview or for a virtual interview, it's very important to know who a follow-up person might be if you aren't able to reach them on the phone, or if they're unable to reach you on the phone, or if we're having technical difficulties. So definitely secure a phone number and email address from for someone that you can follow up with in case you are having technical difficulties. Very important. Other things to note here for the phone interview, you know, with a phone interview, you actually could have more materials in front of you. You could have a copy of the job description in front of you. You could have a copy of your resume. You could have more notes in front of you. You could have a pen in front of you. So there are some advantages to a phone interview because you won't have to remember to make eye contact the entire time, but you'll be able to write more notes and really maybe glance more at your materials in some ways. All right. So just quickly here, some pictures. I want to show business professional. So business professional usually means a jacket's involved and a tie, or just kind of full suit in general. So this is a picture of business professional. Business casual is more of the suiting without the suit jacket and without a blazer. And you can see here there's no tie. So this would be more of business professional, just to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like in case you were wondering. So here, this is a part of my bit on building confidence. And this is something that I like to do myself. So I thought, why not bring this to this webinar? Because I think a lot of times people have a lot of jitters when it comes to interviewing. Some people really love interviewing. Some people really shy away from it. Some people will get excited. Some people get scared, nervous. And I think it's all about kind of calming those nerves, staying focused, staying in the spirit of interviewing. And these are and power poses are a good way to kind of build confidence in yourself. And I like to do power poses before my interview. So before my interview, even if I go to interview in person, I might do a power pose in the bathroom before I walk into the suite or into the space. So these are some examples of power poses. You can see there's this Wonder Woman pose with the arms on the hips to exude confidence. You're kind of standing up straight, you're breathing in, breathing out, and you have your hands on your hips. It's really a power pose. Like she's gonna take on the world, right? You can see the hips here. There's other poses where people will stand up, spread their arms and lean on a desk and lean forward. That's another example of a power pose. And then there's one that you kind of lift your arms up in victory, kind of stretch your arms and breathe in. And usually when you lift your arms up, you get the most air into your lungs anyway. So it's a good way to also relax. And then if you are on the phone, a nice power move. If you're on the phone doing a phone interview and you don't have to worry about somebody watching you, you could conduct the interview by putting your foot on maybe a desk or on a chair. There's a very famous picture of a famous individual that has his foot on a chair in the Oval Office. I won't say who. And it's just a really nice image of seeing someone in power talking on the phone, and you can see that confidence kind of exude in that conversation just by looking at that visual. Another example of power pose would be putting your feet on the table while you're interviewing. And so those are just some examples of power poses. I also like to do some breathing and meditation exercises as well. So really, there's a website called Headspace, which has some nice meditation and breathing exercises that you could do. And it's just a good way to kind of get in the zone and get really focused and become very mindful while you're interviewing. So you stay really in tune to what's being asked of you, what the questions are that you're being asked, and really mindful of how you're responding to really stay in the zone. So yeah, I thought I would drop that bit of information. All right, so preparing for the interview. So I have this image here, preparing for the interview, because I think of it kind of like there's like all these different ingredients, and you're putting together this recipe in some ways, and you're going to deliver this recipe, and the outcome is going to be this really beautiful meal at the end. So I'm going to give you that analogy. So I really like this image here. I thought about preparing for an interview. There's all these different components of it that just kind of come together for this really nice recipe. So we're going to go into that bit. So when I think about preparing for the interview, I like to really think about the company's mission, their vision, strategic plan, products and services, who their competitors are, like really get to know that company inside out. if there's a resource on their website or a report or any kind of documents to be downloaded, like review those, especially if they're in your space, in your functional area, or touch on your functional area. Like read those documents and look and think through those documents and see what within that information, is there anything that stands out to you that you could potentially use as a question for the interviewers or interviewer who will be interviewing you? And then kind of really comb through that information. I think it's really important, because when someone asks you, why do you want to work for this company? This is where you're getting this information from. You're getting it from knowing more about the company's mission, vision, strategic plan, products, services, and competitors. And my rule of thumb is you don't want to ask a question that you can easily find on the website. So if you're asking a question like, well, what products do you produce? And that's on the website, that's kind of a no-no, because it's expected that you have done your research, and the interviewers are expecting that you've taken that time, the due diligence, to know their company and know why you want to work here. So definitely take that time to do that. I also like to take the job description and highlight the key experiences and skills that they're looking for. So you see the job description and it mentions communication skills, social media, marketing, whatever those skills are, highlight those skills, and then look at your resume and highlight where you've done those. And that's going to prepare you for your STAR stories, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And your STAR stories often come from soft skills or competencies that employers are looking for, such as communication, teamwork, leadership, problem solving. Like a lot of those skills are very common across organizations, and that's what we call them transferable skills. So I often like to think about these common core skills and think of examples of those for my work, and then look for other examples that they're asking, other examples of skills that they mentioned within the job description, especially if there's hard skills. You definitely want to have examples of your hard skills and how you use them. All right, let's see. And then aside from that, I also like to think of, aside from just examples of skills and how I've used them in the workplace through my projects or things like that, I like to think about the projects that I'm most proud of and why. And sometimes they don't always fit with maybe tell me about a time where you led a team to success, or some of the other typical behavioral questions you get. But if you think about those really big projects, or the projects that you felt really accomplished, that you felt like you really delivered, think about those projects and think about how you can incorporate those projects that you're really proud of into your STAR stories. So that's another good way to make sure that you can deliver the information that you want them to know about you and your background and what you have to bring to the organization. All right, and then, sorry, 1 second, oops. Oh, 1 second, my computer is not cooperating because, okay, yes. And definitely you want to prepare a list of questions for the interviewer, which I mentioned earlier, and I'll give you some examples of that. Okay, so we're going to talk more. I mentioned the word behavioral interview. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that exactly means and the type of interview that many of you have already gone on in the past, but maybe you didn't know the name of it or why. But a behavioral interview typically is asking, a behavioral interview pretty much begs to the point of thinking about things that you've done in the past as a predictor of future success. And they're often skill-based. So a behavioral interview will be like, tell me about a time when you had to work in a team setting. Tell me about a time when you had to communicate across a team and deliver certain deliverables. So they're often asking you for an example of something you've done in the past, because they're looking for a predictor of future behavior and how you might handle a situation in the future within their organization. So that's why you get a lot of those questions and why we call them behavioral interviews. And as I mentioned, behavioral interviews are often looking for skills that are transferable from organization to organization. And employers often look for very similar skills as a base, as a starting point. So there's some of these very common skills that we call competencies, rather, that most employers are looking for. And there's an organization called the National Association of Colleges and Employers, which brings together career centers and employers, or recruiters rather, and they work together. And there's a survey that goes out every year to employers to ask them, what are the competencies that you're looking for in new recruits or in new hires or people that you're interviewing? And this is what they responded. So in terms of skills that employers are looking for, As you can see, it looks like across the years, critical thinking and problem solving is key. So it's likely that you might have an interview question that gets to this skill, critical thinking and problem solving. Teamwork and collaboration is another big one. So really thinking about how you collaborate with others to deliver and what your role in a team setting has looked like in the past. Thinking about professionalism and work ethic. So thinking about a time where maybe there was a communication breakdown and how you deliver, how you work through that situation and delivered. Oral and written communication skills is also really important, which sometimes these skills are unwritten in the job description. Sometimes they're written in the job description, sometimes they're not written, but these are the things that most employers are looking for. And you can see leadership and then career management. And career management's more about having an introspection and thinking about your goals and your values and how what you're interested in ties to future success. So sometimes you get a question during the interview, tell me about why you're interested in this role and how this ties into your goals. So really having some introspection about your values and interests and highlight how they tie to future success. So that's part of career management. And then global and multicultural fluency. And so a lot of times the question might look like, tell me about a time, or tell me about your experience with diversity and inclusion or your multicultural competency, and be able to give examples of how you've done that. All right. And I mentioned this, that predictor of future behavior. Yes. And we'll talk more about the S.T.A.R response in just a moment. All right. So here I thought I would drop in some examples of some of the common questions and what information you need and what an employer really wants to know in some ways. And so a very common question is, tell me about yourself and why this position. And the information you need to gather is thinking about, one, doing introspection about thinking about things you've done in the past, and so maybe highlight some key experiences that relate to the job that you're applying for. So think about that. And you also want to look at the job description and highlight key experiences and skills that they're looking for, and then kind of cross-tabulate that with your experience. So always think about preparing a short summary. And a colleague of mine, and we've and I've talked about this idea of past, present, future. So talking about, and this is something I believe was published in an online article. So past, present, future. So thinking about creating a short summary of your experience to tell them about what you've done in the past, how it connects to what you're doing right now, and how it connects to the future. So example of that could be currently during my time at, making up some stuff, during my time at Medtronic, I was really invested in X, Y, and Z. I'm currently working on blah, blah, blah project. And within this organization, I see an opportunity to expand blah, blah, blah skill and project area. And this is how I would like to contribute to your organization. So in some ways, you're connecting your past, your present, and to your future in the current job that you're applying to. All right. And definitely, so sometimes when people answer the tell me about yourself and why this position, sometimes I get, there's a lot of personal information that's offered in this tell me about yourself. It's okay to mention, maybe one thing about your life that you'd like to add here if you feel it adds value. But this is really an opportunity to tell them about your professional experiences in the workplace and how it will impact the role. It's not really a space to deliver an overview of your entire resume. So you definitely want to keep it short, about 1 to 2 minutes long. All right. So you might get a separate question asking you why this company. And as I mentioned earlier, definitely research the company's mission, vision, strategic plan, etc. Research the company's competitors, because that's also important information to know. And what they really want to know is, what preparation have you done for this interview? Why this company? There are many places to apply, and maybe you really need a job, but that's not the answer. So definitely dig deep and really understand the company, know what they have to bring, what they have to offer. Are there any charities that they give to that are important to you as well? Those are some things too that are notable that you might want to mention during your interview. Yeah, so I mentioned here what companies really want to know. Have you prepared? What makes this unique compared to other companies? If you've done your research on the competitors, you might find that information. And what makes you excited to work here? So what's exciting about this company? All right, kind of mentioned this earlier. So tell me about a time when you, and then insert skill. So this is a chance for you to really demonstrate that you have transferable skills to bring to this organization. And you definitely want to pull from your past examples that highlight a lot of these skills. And I mentioned here what they really want to know. So the 5 W's, that means what, when, where, why, and how. So this is not a time to be vague. You definitely want to be specific. So talk about the particular position, the particular company, how many people you worked with. So definitely quantify that experience. So if you worked with a team of 5 people to do something, quantify that. If you raise X number of dollars, quantify that. Really give specifics. Sometimes we underestimate how much the interviewer or the human resource person might know about our former work. And so definitely paint a picture for the interviewer. That is your goal, is to really paint the picture so you have a full understanding of the depth of the work that you accomplished in your past role. All right. So I mentioned earlier about the STAR technique and how to respond to questions. So the STAR technique is a really quick way, a nice formula rather, to think about how to formulate your responses to some of these tell me about yourself questions or behavioral questions. And the STAR technique breaks down to situation, task, action, results. So situation is describing the situation with the 5 W's that I mentioned, the what, when, where, when, how, and quantify where possible. The task, what was the task? What was the action you took? So what was your responsibility? And it's okay to use I when responding to some of these questions, but definitely balance it with we a little bit, especially if it was a team project or team approach. Definitely balance how much you talk about I versus we. But this interview is definitely about you, so definitely don't shy away from talking about what you did specifically in a particular project or role. And then what were the results? So more than just telling us about what the project was about, like what was the impact? What impact did you have in the organization? How did it change how you approach your work or how the organization approaches their work? So really think high level in terms of what you did and how it had a greater impact on your organization, your work, others within the organization, or even give maybe some information here regarding data. So if you have any, so say if there's a point of service survey or maybe in your performance evaluation you were given high remarks, mention that here in some way. All right, so this is kind of a quick example that I put together on kind of before and after STAR, and kind of you can see what it looks like to have more of a vague example and then a more detailed example. So the question here is, tell us about a time when you led a team to success. So before STAR, the response might look like, I was tasked with working on a coding project with a group of colleagues and we successfully completed this project. DN. What we don't know is what was the coding project, how many colleagues, what does success look like, and what was the results? Like what does success look like? What are the results? So after STAR, this is my made up example. Here is my example. During my time at Google, I was tasked with working on a major coding project to develop a new software product that would change the way we purchase online goods. I worked with a team of 5 colleagues, and while I was not the team leader, I was tasked with organizing the work group. I ensured we had a timeline, goals, and met regularly. I was able to keep the group on track, and we successfully delivered blah. And it is now widely used by millions of customers. So you can definitely see the transformation from the first example to the second example. I'm being very specific. I'm talking about how I kept everyone tasked. And sometimes we get this question about leadership and we feel like we haven't had a leadership experience, but many of us have taken the reins on some sort of work in the past, even if that was taking notes in a meeting or doing something that's kind of tangential to the actual leadership role of what we traditionally think of as leading. But there's many ways to lead. And so this kind of example that kind of meets both of those things. So showing you how to do a STAR and then kind of how to talk about leadership in some ways. So definitely think about the specifics of how you accomplished your work and give examples of what success looks like or has looked like for you. All right, so now thinking about questions that you might want to ask the interviewer. So the worst thing that can happen is, you have this fabulous interview, you do great, and then the interviewer asks you, what questions do you have for me? And if you say, oh, I'm good, all my questions are answered, thank you so much. That is not a great response. You definitely want to take time to ask some questions. I say at least 3 questions, no more than 5 is usually my rule of thumb. You have to kind of gauge the conversation, and it can be kind of a little bit harder to do virtually than in person, but you can kind of gauge by noticing people's eye contact, see if they're gazing off in space, see if they're looking down a lot, to kind of gauge if you're asking too many or too little questions. And sometimes the interviewers will ask you follow-up questions too, like, based on the questions you ask them. So that might keep the conversation going, which is okay. All right, so some of the questions I wrote down. So here again, I read about X, Y, and Z on your website or in your whatever plan. Can you tell me more about it? So asking for more specifics, especially if it's really relevant to your role. You want to actually know that information, because remember, you are actually interviewing them as well. This is a two-way street. They're interviewing you, but you're also interviewing them to see if this is a place that you would like to work, to understand if this type of work is the type of work you'd like to do, and ensure it's exactly what you expect. So it's a good place to really ask questions about, what a typical day might look like. Tell me about the job description. Job description mentions, I'll just give some examples like career coaching, supervision, and project management. How does that break down in percentage-wise on a day-to-day basis or on a yearly basis? So really getting to know more about your actual job and what you're going to be doing. And then some other questions here I've added. How has this position evolved, which is a nice, good question. How do you evaluate success? So knowing how you're going to be evaluated. So thinking about performance evaluation down the road, like what's going to determine success for them? What does success look like? How is it evaluated? Is it quantified? Is it, yeah, and so forth. And then some other questions I often like to ask to gauge culture is, what do you like most about working here? And that question could be very eye-opening for you as an interviewer. So you ask, what do you like the most about working here, or what motivates you to work here, or something like that. And you see a lot of silence and looking down, and people not sure who should go first because it looks like they're still building their thoughts. That might be some telltale signs for you to think and ask more probing questions about the culture. And so that's always a good question I like to ask, to see what enthusiasm kind of comes through from the people who are interviewing me and see what they have to say. And then kind of noting, like, what are they focusing on when they're, speaking about why they like to work there. And so, and thinking about how that fits with my own values and interests, and if that's okay with how I like to work. And so, yeah. And then a good question I like to ask is, do you have any hesitations about my qualifications? So this is a bold question, and I've done it on many of the interviews that I've gone into, and it's been really helpful because it gives you an opportunity to clarify anything that your interviewer might have hesitations with in terms of your candidacy. So if they have hesitations in terms of how you might be a leader, for example, you could clarify that with the employer and give them another example of how you've handled, leadership or something like that in the past. And so it gives you an opportunity to kind of offer more information to help the interviewer understand more about your candidacy and why you might be qualified for that position. And it also helps you understand where they're at. Like, you can kind of gauge what the barometer is. If you couldn't tell, sometimes you can tell in an interview when people are really engaged, they're asking you good questions, there's lots of eye contact, lots of head nodding, lots of follow-up questions. Like, that's usually a sign that the interview is going well. But it's also good to ask this question here, because it gives you understanding, like, how telling were some of those signs, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of clear some things up as well. And often asking, what are next steps? So what are next steps is a great question to ask, because it also shows that you're still interested in the position. You could also say something like, I'm still really interested in this position. I'm really excited about, getting started. what are the next steps? And so they might tell you, you know, well, we're still in the interview process. It might be 2 weeks from now before you hear from us, but this gives you an idea of the timeline that you might expect. I've also heard some career coaches coach people on actually asking for the job. And that's another really bold move. But if you have it in you, go ahead and ask for that job and say, you know, I'm really interested in the position. I'm really excited. You know, can you hire me? Would you be willing to hire me right now? And kind of gauge their response to you and see what they say. And oftentimes, you know, depending on your industry, you might get a yes, and others you might have to, you know, there might be another round of so many more interviews and so forth that they have to go through. But, you know, you can try it out if you feel that it's appropriate for industry, especially if like you're in the business sector or somewhere that's really fast paced and fast moving and that's really metrics driven. I think asking for that interview for the job would be most appropriate, especially if you're in that type of space where you're expected to sell. All right, I'll show you the next one. All right, so another important piece is the follow-up. So you want to follow up as soon as possible within 24 hours. So that means sending a thank you note. And sending a thank you note, I know back in the day, earlier in my career, I used to send a hard copy thank you note, thank you letter on resume paper, and I used to mail one to every single person who interviewed me. But sometimes some things have changed a bit, especially with us working remotely, and a lot of times hiring managers want to make decisions quickly. I really encourage you to send a thank you note by email. And in this thank you note, you're thanking them for the opportunity to interview for the position at their company. And you're gonna and I want you to talk about in that thank you letter something particular that you learned about that organization or that position that you gained from asking some of those questions that you asked them at the end of the interview, or things that they mentioned. So you want to make it very more personable, especially if there are different people interviewing you. If you have 3 people, for example, those are 3 different thank you notes, and you want to try to make them as personable as possible by noting something that those individuals mentioned during your interview, if you can. And then reinstate your enthusiasm and tell them you're really excited about getting started and you look forward to hearing from them. And I can send an example of a thank you note, to a follow-up thank you note as well after today's presentation. So you can see an example of what that looks like. And if you still want it, you could send a hard copy in the mail, but a lot of people are working remotely, so they might not get it. All right, so now it's time for Q&A. And I'm gonna open this up. So Marissa Smith, the Director of Recent Alumni and Student Engagement, will be joining me to help me kind of field some of the questions that we asked. And she'll stay off camera, but she's gonna be asking me questions. She's kind of looking at the Q&A box. So if you have questions, enter your questions into the Q&A box, and then Marissa will field those questions to me.
Hi, Rebecca. Great presentation. Thought there was lots and lots of helpful tips shared there. And we've had a few questions come in. And like Rebecca said, feel free to keep them coming and we'll get to them. So a few came in at the beginning as you were talking about setting the scene for the virtual interview. The first one is, what do you think of the idea of having the virtual background be the logo of the company that you're interviewing with?
You know, that's kind of a bold move. I'm gonna admit I have used something in another context. I've used the PowerPoint sort of template of that company to do my presentation, because I wanted to show that I kind of identified with that organization by using their colors and their in some ways. So I think that would be fine. I think that would be just fine.
I'll also add, we have the Zoom webinar chat open right now. So if there are any hiring managers out there who have opinions on the questions that are coming in, feel free to drop that in.
Yeah.
I think, a lot of this world is still so new. I even did a little Google search on that question and couldn't find much in the way of advice. So if anyone has any alternative opinions, feel free to drop it in the chat.
The one thing I would stay away from is, so I've seen cover letters in the past, or like a cover letter document on letterhead of that company.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're working for the University of Minnesota, and then you're applying to a job at the University of Minnesota, and then you find they're writing on letterhead. I find that to be more of a no-no.
Mm-hmm.
It just feels like you're kind of,
You have to be mindful about how you're representing yourself.
yeah, it kind of looks like a
Yeah.
more of an official document that it shouldn't be in some way.
Sure.
And it's almost like you're representing that organization on paper in that way.
Right. So the next question was around technology for the virtual interview. And this individual is talking about, can I use an iPad for the virtual interview? It's kind of small, but I feel bad using my current employer's computer to conduct a virtual interview.
Yeah, it's a tough one. So if you have an iPad, there may be some sort of stands or something like that you could look into to hold your iPad steady. So I think as long as the iPad is steady and that it's not shaky and it's easy to like look into, that would be appropriate. Marissa, do you happen to know if there's stands for iPads? I know your iPad.
There are stands for iPads. I haven't purchased one, but I am getting really proficient at the book stacking so that you can get it just right. The next question that came in is sort of related to that. How far back should I sit from my camera, and at what level? Should my face be at the same level as the camera?
Yeah, I like to have a little bit of space, as you can see here, like there's like that much space between my head and the camera. So think of it like a portrait picture. So you almost want to look like you're in a portrait. So there's nice space around you and just looks like a picture. And in terms of how far to sit from the camera, I'm probably, like maybe 20 inches away or so with my laptop. I could move it closer if I want it, which would still be fine. And that's okay too.
I think how Rebecca has herself positioned in the frame where we're really seeing her straight on. Her face is neither too large nor too small in the frame. Is a really good example of how to nail this look.
Yeah, and I have my laptop at the edge of my desk, so it's right there.
Great. How do you suggest balancing eye contact with the camera versus eye contact with the interviewer when they're speaking? Is it acceptable to look at their image when they're speaking and then look into the camera when I'm speaking?
That's really hard.
These are great questions that are really, really exemplifying how new this is for so many of us.
Yeah, I would say just continue to look dead on into the camera, because I think it can be difficult to continue shifting your eye contact. And I think because you're usually, if the interviewer is asking you a question, everyone's watching your response. So I think it's very appropriate to look dead on to the camera to answer your question, because everyone's listening into that question.
Couple of questions came in related to the general interview strategies that you shared. So regarding questions for the interviewer, what do you do if the time frame for the interview is nearing the end and there isn't much or any time left to ask the questions you have?
So it depends on how that kind of conversation kind of wraps up. You can ask, like, I noticed we're getting towards the end. Do I have time for one or two questions, and see what they say? So kind of gauge their response to you, and think, yeah, say sure. Fine. Think about that one question you really want to ask, and ask that one question. And then in your follow-up email, you could ask, if you really do have like one or two questions in your thank you note, you could ask like one more question that you want clarification on.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. There's a difficult dance, I feel like, that happens there between the interviewer and the interviewee. Yes. Has the interviewer shared the length of time that's allotted for the interview with you? Yeah. Did you manage your time poorly? Did they manage the time poorly? But being respectful. And I think, Rebecca shared a great tip about how asking questions can both clarify things for you, but then also show your interest in the position. And I think if you're running out of time, make sure that the questions are more in that first category of like really helping you understand things that you need to make your decision, not just showing interest in the position because they might have to get on to the next interview.
Yeah.
This is another question. What's the best way to go about sending a thank you to an interviewer when you don't have their contact information?
I pick up the phone and I call.
Yeah.
Pick up the phone and I call that main line and I say, I'm looking to connect with so-and-so in such department. Is there a good email address that I can reach out to them? I just had this fantastic interview and I want to thank them for their time. Is there a good email address that I can reach them at? And usually that person on the other end is understanding and they'll provide you some sort of email. Because trying to find email addresses and contact information can be very difficult on some large organizations' websites. So definitely don't be afraid to pick up the a phone and give them a call, especially the human resource department.
That's great. Another question came in about questions in an interview. I usually have a set of 10 boilerplate questions. I usually get to them all, but not always. Is that too much in general?
Yes, I would say so. I think you want to cut it down to no more than 5, because there's a lot of questions. So 10 questions can be a little bit much, especially given the time allotted. I think it might be hard to accomplish all 10 questions within the time that you're given. So definitely zero in on what you really want to know, because I think that shows that you've been kind of more efficient with your questions and with your time. So really try to cut it back a little bit.
Another question, I'm applying to medical school and found a lot of the information on this webinar helpful and relevant. That's yay. My question during my interviews, I'm applying to other institutions, but is it okay that my virtual background will be the undergraduate institution I graduated from, the University of Minnesota?
And you're applying to other institutions? I'd say that maybe you wanted to skip the virtual background. I mean, you could keep it if you really like it, if you think it looks really nice and crisp and professional. It can show where you're coming from, but in some ways, they already know what university you're coming from. They've read your credentials, they know your background. So I think you can stay away from representing the University of Minnesota in some ways during your future interviews, especially if you're trying to identify with that organization. I think that could probably detract a little bit from it.
I agree with that advice, but you're more than welcome to go back to wearing maroon and gold right before the interview, right after the interview, and showing that Gopher pride.
You can wear a pin or something.
Yes. Next question. I am from a different country. I feel that cultural backgrounds and personal values can make an interviewee's answer sound different than others. Is that possible? My question will be around how do I overcome this bias?
Oh, that's a good one. I think I would really take the time to think about those questions that they might ask you. So prep for yourself, maybe 5 questions they might ask you. Write down what your response might look like, and really think about the core of your answers. Like, what do you really want them to know about your background and your experiences? And how do those contribute to that organization? And even if you think there's some differences in values and things like that, and those come through within your responses, think about what added value that adds. Because having differing perspectives and differing approaches to work is really important in the workplace. And I think that's a part that's a good selling point for anyone who comes from a different background, different experiences. So definitely sell that part of your experiences and backgrounds.
Great. What are tips that you have on managing a question from the interviewer that you don't feel confident in answering?
Oh, yeah. So sometimes you like, it depends on what kind of question that is. So if you're thinking if you don't feel confident answering that because maybe you don't have the quick answer to it, you know, it's hard to generate the answer. You can even ask the interviewer, do you mind if I have a moment or two to reflect on a response? And then oftentimes the interviewer say, yeah, sure. Yeah, take a moment. You can ask them to rephrase the question. Do you mind rephrasing that question for clarification? So I have a good understanding. So that also kind of buys you time. And it can also help you narrow in on what they're asking of you. And so that's a good way to kind of help you kind of turn that question around a little bit more, and so you better understand the question and maybe have more clues or context clues that help you answer that question.
Great advice. And we just have one more question. I think it's a good one to end the conversation on. What is the biggest mistake you can make in a virtual interview besides standing up and you're wearing shorts?
Yelling at your children. I think maintaining composure is very important. I think building rapport with others. So sometimes when I've interviewed myself for tons of jobs. I've also interviewed lots of people for jobs that I've hired for. I think sometimes it can be awkward when you first put your camera on. There's this weird silence. Sometimes not all the interviewers are on Zoom yet, so you're stuck there with like one person or two people. Make small talk. you know, ask them how the interviewer's day is going. Ask them how the rest of their interviews are going. Make small talk, be personable, show the human side of yourself so you can connect with the interviewer on the other side. Everyone's human. It's an interview. It's going to be over in 20 minutes. So definitely take the time to get to know that person, build a connection, and just be excited about being there. Show your enthusiasm, smile, nod, which is really good. Nodding is really important to show that you're understanding and you're paying attention. But definitely, you know, let that human side of you come out. And, you know, sometimes I imagine that I'm talking to a friend on the other side, that, you know, I'm talking to my mom or a good trusted colleague or something like that. And it helps really build confidence in myself, and helps portray that confidence with the person on the other side. I think I answered your question.
I think that's all of the questions that came in. I thought you did a great job, and there were lots of great questions from folks, and including a few that came in at the end saying just again how helpful the content was, and thanking you for taking the time for sharing.
Yeah.
I learned a lot myself. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, and I'm happy to do another interviewing webinar in the future if need be, if there's more desire to have more a detailed approach to this, question by question or anything like that. I could definitely do that in the future. So I'll be sending out a survey to everyone who participated, all registrants, to give me their feedback on today's webinar and to tell me more about what topics you want to see in the future. So if there are topics that are burning that come to mind that you really want to see me do, let me know. I'm planning for the next fiscal year, and I'm putting together my programming, and I would love to take many of those thoughts and ideas into consideration. So definitely fill out the survey that I send out. I'll be sending out the YouTube video, and I'll also be sending out some resources in terms of job board resources that you could refer to, and also resources on illegal interview questions that I did not get to today. So I'll be sending that out, and I'll include that in the slide deck as well. So thank you so much for participating today. I've enjoyed talking with you, and have a great day. Goodbye.